Agravain, the Knight of the Hard Hand, also known as Agravain the Proud, the Arrogant, the Unwounded, and a man who certainly doesn't hide his opinions. By looking into his class, design, skill set, backstory, and characterization, how well does Fate's version of Agravain compare to his mythical counterpart? And what grade would I give his depiction? Let's get into it. Agravain is the first character I'm covering who isn't actually summonable in Fate Grand Order. When I first started looking at characters from Arthurian legend, I got tons of requests to do a video on Agravain. Then, after I added him to the list, I got tons of comments asking how, or even why, I'd do a video on him. Well, it's time to answer all of that. Officially, we don't have a class for Agravain. You never fight him in the Camelot Singularity. And he's still not summonable in-game even after 9 years for JP, and 7 for NA. To be perfectly honest, I don't think we will ever see this guy become summonable. But if we actually did get Agravain, there are 2 classes that might work. The first is Saber, which it could work, but he wasn't exactly renowned for his swordsmanship. But the other, more interesting class choice for Agravain is Assassin. A Round Table Knight qualifying as an assassin? Believe it or not, it could actually work. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that, though not to the same extent as his hated rival Lancelot, Agravain does have a story in the post-Vulgate cycle where he conceals his identity and attacks someone, his younger brother, Gaheris. The short version is that Agravain was pissed off about his younger brother being knighted before him, and so he disguised himself and went out to attack Gaheris while Gaheris was off pursuing a quest. But Gaheris beat Agravain twice, proving that he was the better of the 2. It's not the best example of an assassin's presence concealment skill perhaps, but it's something I guess. But a much better link to the assassin class lies in Agravain's behavior in the legends. To put it simply, Agravain was a team killer, being involved in the deaths of Sir Lamorak, Sir Dinadan, and, had he not been stopped by Gawain, he probably would have killed his brother Gaheris too. There's even a version where he, not Gaheris, is the one to kill their mother, Morgause. I'll get into more detail about this later, but the gist is, Agravain is less the type of knight to go questing and save damsels, and is more the type who gets into feuds, holds grudges, and then murders them if he gets the opportunity, often together with his half-brother Mordred. Getting into his character design, Agravain is noticeably different from the other Round Table Knights we get in Fate in that, well, he looks like a villain, with the black armor and a face that doesn't exactly scream hero, especially when he shows his teeth. At the very least, he stands out among his fellow Round Table Knights, who are often wearing much lighter colors. But something that's going to continue coming up throughout this video is that Agravain's depictions throughout Arthurian legend contrast quite a bit. His first appearances had him depicted as a more chivalrous, honorable knight, albeit still one who didn't get along well with others. Over time though, Agravain gradually transformed into an outright villain, becoming a murderous, misanthropic thug, which is usually how he's depicted in more modern portrayals. I bring this up now because sometimes Agravain is described as being very handsome, not quite as much as Lancelot or Gawain, but still handsome, while in others he is ugly and misshapen, an appearance to match his ugly personality. Fate seems to be leaning more towards the latter, though, well, I wouldn't call him ugly, just that he looks like a villain. I'm not sure what other ascension forms Agravain could get if he ended up as a servant, but I imagine that they would have a similar vibe. A dark, sinister-looking knight that really makes him seem like the odd man out among the Round Table Knights. I think it's a good design. Moving into his skill set, Agravain doesn't really have one. We do get a glimpse of some of his abilities in Camelot though, so let's look at those. The main skill we see him use are his chains, called the Iron Commandments, which Agravain uses in 2 ways. The first is to bind someone, holding them in place. They are particularly effective against servants, though a regular human is able to break them. Relating to this, it is mentioned that Agravain is skilled at interrogation and forcing information out of people. Now, while I have seen a few bits about Agravain being a skilled torturer, I can't find any specific examples. But this could also be more symbolic, since Agravain does display skill in trapping an enemy in order to force them to expose the truth. After all, it's the part of Arthurian legend Agravain is most famous for, his plot to expose Lancelot's affair with Guinevere, and to do so in a way that was impossible to deny. This isn't quite interrogation, but Agravain did bring that affair to light, though it got him killed in the process. The other notable use of his chains is to enhance allies, or even himself, granting them a boost in power akin to madness enhancement. Agravain says that he modeled this after someone he doesn't name, but is quite obviously Zerker Lancelot. Considering that it was Agravain's plot to expose Lancelot's affair with Guinevere that caused Lancelot's most infamous rampage, and that Agravain was on the receiving end of it, I'd say he knows a thing or two about Lancelot's brand of madness. Obviously, this isn't a skill Agravain had in Arthurian legend, but him making use of the power that got him killed in the legends? I think that's fine. Also, he is able to give this madness enhancement to himself, which is what allows him to defeat Lancelot in the Camelot Singularity. Aside from these chains, we don't really see other abilities from Agravain in FGO, so what else might we be able to give him? The only other notable thing that comes to mind is from one of his nicknames, Agravain the Unwounded. Despite Agravain losing the fights he gets into more often than not, it is said that while he doesn't enter battle very often, when he does, Agravain tends to emerge from battle unscathed, without any wounds. There's nothing supernatural at play here. Agravain isn't like Achilles or Roland, it just somehow turns out that way. Aside from that one time Lancelot kills him, obviously. As for his MP, we don't get a solid answer for what he would get in Fate, and to tell you the truth, I'm not entirely certain either. My choice for an Agravain MP would be making use of his chains to expose his enemy, like he did with Lancelot. An MP that removes defense buffs, perhaps. Maybe it could even be an Arash situation where using this MP gets him killed. Agravain isn't the type to defeat the enemy himself, but giving others the opportunity to strike at his foe? That makes sense to me based upon his role in the legends. In my eyes, a hypothetical Agravain servant would be more of a support character, someone who helps his allies achieve victory, rather than being the one to deal the finishing blow himself. This is all just my own opinion, though. I'm sure many of you have your own thoughts about this. Feel free to put forth your own ideas in the comments. Craft essences, obviously we don't have any. If I had to give him one, maybe something having to do with getting murdered by Lancelot, or perhaps some kind of memento from the Camelot Singularity? I'm not sure. I know I'm really showing my lack of creativity here, but there isn't a whole lot to work with either. Now for characterization, starting with a look into the legends surrounding Agravain. Agravain is the second son of King Lot of Orkney and his wife Morgause, making him younger than Gawain, but older than Gaheris, Gareth, and their half-brother Mordred. When it comes to his portrayal in Arthurian legend, there is quite a big difference between how Agravain started out and how he is often depicted today. Like with Bedivere, Agravain doesn't get a lot of page time, and so I'll be looking at Agravain as a whole rather than just sticking to Mallory's version. Agravain's first appearance in Arthurian legend came in the poem Perceval, the Story of the Grail, written by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century. This poem is not only the first appearance of Agravain, but also Percival and Gareth. But de Troyes never finished this story, suffering from a mild case of death, and so we only have tiny bits of Agravain in it. While it does portray Agravain as a haughty and prideful man, giving us the names Agravain the Proud and Agravain the Arrogant, it also shows him to be loyal to his family members, standing up for his brother Gawain when he is falsely accused of treason. Because de Troyes never fully fleshed out Agravain's character, it was left up to other authors in the Vulgate and post-Vulgate cycles to do so. And, well, the Agravain they created is a pretty nasty piece of work. The writers take Agravain's nicknames of the Proud and the Arrogant to their ugliest conclusion, making Agravain a character who is envious, a bully, and spiteful towards those who are superior to him. I already talked about conflicts with his younger brother, Gaheris, how Agravain was upset about being knighted after Gaheris despite being the older brother, and so Agravain tried and failed to defeat Gaheris on the road. Envy is at the core of Agravain's character. If someone manages to best Agravain in some way, it pisses him off, leading to hostility, grudges, and murder if he can get away with it. When his brother Gaheris killed their mother Morgause, Agravain wanted to kill Gaheris, not to avenge their mother, but because he hated Gaheris. Gawain prevented this though, saying kinslayers aren't exactly looked upon favorably, and so Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Mordred teamed up to kill Sir Lamorak instead, who had been doing lewd things with Morgause. It was Gaheris walking in on them that caused him to kill his mother. Another incident involved Sir Dinadan, Tristan's prankster friend, who ended up needling Agravain a bit about the murder of Sir Lamorak, something he and others saw as dishonorable. Agravain did not forget this slight, And of course, years later, when he was returning to Camelot from the Grail quest, Sir Dinadan was ambushed and killed by Agravain and Mordred. But of all the knights in King Arthur's court, none attracted more of Agravain's envy and hatred than Lancelot, the supreme knight who seemed to have all the virtues that a knight ought to have, the virtues Agravain lacked, and so hated to see in others. Agravain also seems to have something of a woman problem. The root cause for this seems to be his mother, Morgause, the character who is now often merged into Morgan Le Fay. With the possible exception of Gareth, Morgause was an awful parent to all of her sons, being manipulative, cruel, and neglectful. This seems to have hit Agravain particularly badly, and so colored his opinions of women for much of his life. Combined with his tendency to act like a bully, this resulted in some very ugly behavior. In the Vulgate Merlin, Gawain asks his brothers what they would do if they ended up alone in a room with a lady, and Agravain's response was to say that he would do things, with or without consent. It probably shouldn't surprise you to find out that Gawain, famed for being a champion of ladies, had a very serious problem with Agravain's answer, provoking a fight between the two. Another incident from the prose Lancelot, also part of the Vulgate cycle, has Agravain getting cursed by two ladies for his behavior. First for wounding a lady's knight upon the arm and laughing about it, and second for trying to force himself upon another lady, only to get grossed out by an infection upon her leg. Fittingly, the two curses afflicted Agravain upon his arm and his leg, and it was only with the blood of the two finest knights in the world, Lancelot and Gawain, that the curse was lifted. But Agravain's hatred of women could be cured, or at least alleviated, when he encountered women that made him rethink his prejudice. One example comes from a 14th century work written by Jean Froissart, Miliador, where Agravain is love-struck by Florie, championing and later getting married to her. In Malory, Florie is swapped out for Laurel, a niece of Lady Lyonesse, though this marriage is much less happy. But the woman that did the most to cool Agravain's misogyny was Queen Guinevere, who Agravain saw as the opposite of his mother, someone worthy of admiration, beautiful, courteous, and devoted to her king. But when Agravain discovered the affair between the queen he respected and Lancelot, the knight that he hated the most, well, let's just say that Agravain didn't take it very well. The reasons for Agravain's anger vary depending upon the author. Hatred and jealousy of Lancelot, feeling betrayed by the queen that he admired, the affair itself being a betrayal of his king, and his own sense of morality and righteousness. Whatever it was, Agravain became hell-bent upon exposing the affair, and so he began seeking out allies to do so. Agravain first went to his brothers, but Gawain, Gaheris, and Gareth wanted nothing to do with his plan. He found the ally he was looking for in Mordred, Agravain's half-brother, and his past partner in crime for the murders of Sir Lamorak and Sir Dinadan. Mordred, of course, had his own motivations for causing trouble in Camelot, motivations that differed from Agravain's. How much Agravain knew of what Mordred was truly after is unclear. What we do know is that Agravain, Mordred, and 10 other younger knights hatched a plot, getting the reluctant support of King Arthur. The king would go on a hunting trip with some of his other knights, but not invite Lancelot, giving Lancelot a chance to go visit Guinevere while the king was away, and so to give Agravain and his party a chance to catch Lancelot in the act. This plan worked exactly as anticipated, at least until Lancelot decided to fight back. In Malory, Lancelot ends up killing Agravain and the 10 other knights, with Mordred only barely managing to escape. In the Vulgate cycle, however, Agravain survives this encounter, only to be killed during Lancelot's rescue of Guinevere, not in a mad rampage, but because Lancelot specifically wanted Agravain dead. While he doesn't get much page time, Agravain has a massive impact in Arthurian legend, since his exposure of Lancelot's affair with Guinevere started the chain of events that led to the fall of Camelot. Because of his role in Camelot's fall combined with his dislikable personality, Agravain is often depicted as a villain, someone lacking in redeeming qualities who seems to get worse with every retelling. But it didn't necessarily start that way, and there are other ways of looking at the character. Something that comes up regularly with Agravain is how it was treacherous of him to expose the affair, as if him doing so was an evil act. On the other hand, the affair itself being an act of treachery and immorality, that is said far less often. Also, one of the things you notice when looking at the medieval text of Arthurian legends You learn much about what characters do or say, but much less about why they do or say those things. In other words, characters are open to interpretation, and while Agravain is often portrayed as the villain, this is not always the case. And that brings us to Agravain, and his depiction in Fate Grand Order, where he has a prominent role in the Camelot Singularity. Here, he is serving as the secretary to the Lion King, not a role he had in the Legends as far as I can tell, but he is probably the only real choice since the other knights the Lion King summons are, well, they're much more combat-oriented than he is. Anyway, Agravain runs the king's court, gives orders, and manages things since the Lion King seems too indifferent to fuss about the details. Because of this, and because of the things this kingdom gets up to, all the refugee murder and launching orbital strikes against small villages, and how that seems completely out of character for King Arthur, it doesn't take long for people to wonder if Agravain is the true mastermind here. Lancelot certainly thinks so, that Agravain has poisoned the mind of the king, and that this is why the Camelot Singularity has gone so wrong, and why the Knights of the Round Table are engaged in such immoral acts. All of this, of course, turns out to be a massive red herring. It's not Agravain causing all this horrible stuff, but the Lion King themselves, thanks to having lost their humanity and becoming a deity due to the influence of Rongo Miniad. But we don't actually confirm this until the very end of Camelot, and so until then, Agravain looks like the obvious villain. Still, there are hints that Agravain isn't quite the monster that he seems. Despite how he often reacts harshly to any perceived slight towards his king, Agravain is the only one of the Lion King's knights to question how poorly Mordred is treated. Granted, the two of them are half-siblings and were allies in life, but it's interesting that it is Agravain who takes issue with this, and not a more moral knight, for lack of a better word. Later on, when Lancelot expresses his belief that it is Agravain who is responsible for all the horrible things going on, Bedivere and Mash rise to his defense. They do concede that Agravain is a very dislikable guy, but that he was often misunderstood, considered to be a villain, an agent of his mother Morgan. But if Agravain had truly sought to destroy Camelot, then why did everything start to fall apart only after Agravain's death? Agravain's true motivations finally come out during his fight with Lancelot. When Lancelot accuses Agravain of being a traitor, it sets off a rant that explains much about Agravain's feelings and motivations. While his lines about hating women are the ones people tend to remember, I'd say that Agravain is actually more misanthrope than misogynist. He doesn't really like anybody. Agravain just fixates upon women because of the three people that have upset him most in life, Morgan, Guinevere, and Lancelot. Two of them are women, and one of them is his mother, so you can see why it sticks in his head. Mordred has similar issues, though she's also been gender flipped, so it's a bit more complicated. But what drives Agravain's actions most is actually loyalty to his king, making him quite similar to Bedivere, except that Bedivere believes in Artoria as a person, while Agravain is more focused on Artoria as a ruler. Agravain came to believe that Artoria was the best person to rule, and so dedicated himself to serving her with everything he had. And since Lancelot had started an affair with the queen, that he had betrayed the king they both served, that is what set Agravain off. And despite not caring to make himself likable to others, his efforts are still appreciated by those who recognize them, notably Bedivere, Mash, and Artoria herself. That final scene of the Camelot Singularity between her and Agravain was a great conclusion to one of FGO's best main story chapters. Fate's portrayal of Agravain is much more generous than what he usually gets in Arthurian legend. He is still dislikable, indifferent to morality, and is openly misanthropic and misogynistic. But compared to the legends, Fate's version of Agravain doesn't try to kill his own allies, isn't driven by envy, and commits no acts of sexual assault, at least as far as we know. And yet, going all the way back to the original medieval legends, one interpretation of Agravain is that his efforts to expose Lancelot's affair with Guinevere was out of loyalty to his king, that he couldn't tolerate that the king was being betrayed by his best knight. And so while Fate's Agravain is different from his usual portrayals, being less of a bastard, it's not necessarily wrong. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Agravain's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, his character design and non-existent skill set are pretty decent. I'll admit it's kinda hard to analyze something that doesn't exist after all, but what we do have is promising. The real focus is on characterization. which we get plenty of in the Camelot Singularity. Agravain is the Round Table Knight that nobody likes, but in Fate that's because he doesn't make any effort to be likable, rather than because he is an envious team killer who talks about forcing himself on women. In most depictions of the character, it is usually Agravain's hatred and jealousy that drives his actions. Fate goes in another direction, portraying Agravain as still being dislikable, but also a very loyal servant to the king that is often misunderstood by others. It's one of the nicest portrayals Agravain has ever gotten, while still keeping him connected to the original. In this regard, Agravain is much like Bedivere, a character who had limited page time in Arthurian legend, but ended up getting a much more interesting portrayal in the Fate franchise. He may not be Agravain as he usually is in Arthurian legend, but I'd say that Fate gave us something better. And so for a final grade, I'm going to give Agravain, the Knight of the Hard Hand, a C+. And with that, I've covered all of the servants from Arthurian legend that we have in FGO, at least until they add more. Hooray! If you would like to learn more about Agravain's hated rival, check out my video on Lancelot here. Also please like, subscribe, and come check out the streams during the weekend sometime, starting at noon Pacific. Until next time.